Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Noelia, and I will be your host for today. If you can hear us, please type llama in the chat. I am here with Emily today, and she will be teaching us and showing us her process when painting floral arrangements. So I am very excited. And we've got our first llama in the chat. Yay! Um, Before we start off today, I just want to remind you that if you haven't yet, you should subscribe to our channel so that you get notifications every single time we go live, and share the link for today's video with your artist friends or friends in general so that they can join us as well. We will be answering as many questions as we can today. Keep in mind that this is not necessarily a step-by-step tutorial. This is just a way for Emily to show you what she can do. If you want to follow along, that is great. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat. If you would kindly type question in all caps, followed by your question typed normally. That'll make it super easy for me to spot those questions in the chat and not miss any of them. I might be saving some of them for a Q&A at the end just to not disrupt the flow of this demonstration today. And I want to remind you that we have our next live demo tomorrow, Monday, June 14th. So keep posted. And there's no reference image for today. But if you really need something to visualize what we will be painting today, I will drop a link in the chat that is similar to what we will be painting. And thank you, Emily. She just dropped it right there. But without anything else to say, I'll leave it up to you, Emily. And if you could show us a little bit of your work, that would be amazing.
Yep, thank you. Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Emily Wassell. I'm a watercolour artist and educator based in the UK. So I live in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is the hometown of Shakespeare. So yeah, I've been painting watercolour for, goodness, a few years now. It started when I needed a bit of a creative outlet from my really corporate day job. I work in advertising. So I was just looking for some way to, get a bit of creativity. I fell in love with watercolour. It's a really good medium for people like me who are a little bit, kind of a control freak and not very good at letting go, because with watercolor, you just have to put the water on the paint and put it on the paper and let it all kind of mix together as it wants. So that was, really a big kind of change in my mentality. So I really specialize in painting florals and botanicals. So a lot of it is inspired by the English countryside around where I live, and much of it is now drawn from my imagination as well. So yeah, not very good at using references, but making it up as I go along, which is, my favorite kind of style. I really like a loose style. So I'll show you, this is more or less what we're going to be painting today. So it's got some different flowers in here, and I really like being able to make them into big compositions as well. So we've got kind of bigger flowers and roses, which are, really common in the UK where I grew up, and then smaller flowers and loads of different types of leaves. And we're playing around with different kind of bleeds and textures. So you can use this as an inspiration, but we'll just be kind of building it out as we go. And I'll show you some other examples as well. So this is one I painted the other day, just playing around with the new Etcher paper that they kindly sent me. So yeah, again, roses, kind of loose based anemones. They're not particularly any kind of flower. They're just, nice big blousy petaled ones with lots of squiggly leaves, which are a bit of a signature leaf. Also got some more pink ones. So another thing that I quite like to do is allow all of the petals and the leaves to blend together. And I've thrown, you can see a bit of salt in this one while it's wet, which is a really great technique if you want to get a bit of texture. So that's a really nice creative one. You can probably tell my color scheme by now. It's a lot of pinks and blues. I'm a big fan of using blue leaves and doing little tiny flowers as well as fillers. So that's something that we'll definitely be looking at. There's also some really big ones. I love a really big jagged leaf. They're really easy to do by just scrubbing back and forth. They're a really nice kind of filler leaf for a bit more texture as well.
Artsy Jessie says, love the color bleeds and choice of colors.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's to be honest, my absolute favorite thing about watercolor. You know, it's such a unique medium in how it all mixes together when you put it on the page. It makes effects that, you know, you just can't get with other mediums. And you really, the best thing to do with those is just to let it do its thing. Don't try and kind of mess around with your brush or force it. It will just go where it wants to go. And we consider them happy accidents. You know, they're not, we're not controlling this. We're just letting the watercolor do its magic.
Yeah.
Bit of an older one, some more eucalyptus leaves in here as well, and a few berries. I tend to go very seasonal, so this is more of a like winter Christmassy painting. So you can see that I'm very inspired by the changing seasons and the countryside around me. And this is more of a spring one. So we had some blues with these little orange stamen. So I've been experimenting with using some watercolor pencils on the surface to just add a bit of texture as well.
Oh, I was wondering how you did those little details on some of the leaves.
Yeah, it's a recent thing I've been playing around with, but I do quite like the pencils just to give a bit of controlled detail over the top.
Awesome. They look beautiful, and there are many comments in the chat saying how beautiful they are and how excited they are for today.
Amazing.
And that brings me to our first question. Is 100% cotton paper necessary for painting?
Oh, this is such a good question, and one that comes up all the time from, you know, people who are starting to learn with watercolor. So the reason 100% paper is recommended is that what you get on watercolor paper that's different from other kinds of paper is that it's designed to hold the water on the surface. So that gives you time, you know, when everything's wet, to kind of blend and paint other areas, add more colors. If the watercolor paper is, you know, cellulose or another kind of material, it doesn't stay on the surface as much, so it absorbs into the paper and it dries, and that makes it much harder to create all of the effects and the blends and add the other colors. So 100% cotton paper will give you more time. It also means that it stays on the surface much longer and it dries evenly. So when it doesn't dry evenly, or if you get too much water, you can get things like this, which is a hard edge. So that's very much like a puddle where it's dried and then you've got a little edge around the puddle. So that's when the paper doesn't dry evenly. For me, these aren't a problem. I quite like using a lot of watercolor and letting it do its thing. You know, if it has hard edges, then that's fine by me, but some people don't like them. So in a roundabout way, 100% cotton watercolor paper is the best quality, but you can absolutely paint on other types of watercolor paper. It just needs a little bit more control with how much water you're using to check you don't have puddles or patches. And it means if you do want to do lots of blends, you have to be just a little bit quicker because it does dry quicker.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the very detailed explanation. I really appreciate that.
Amazing.
So I think we're good to get started.
Amazing. Shall I run through what I'm using?
Sure, please.
So I'm using the Etcher watercolor block. So this is 50% cotton, 50% cellulose paper. So it's a mixture of the two materials. It is cold press, and the block essentially means that, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the camera, but it is glued on that edge. So it has the sides that are loose, and it's glued on those edges. Now, because I use such a lot of water when I paint, I really like to paint on blocks because I'm no good at stretching the paper and pinning it down with tape. I like to be able to move it around, which is why I quite like the blocks. So for brushes, I am a big fan of Princeton. So I've got two ranges here, the Aqua Elite, which is in a size 6 round, and I also like the 4050 Heritage range. They're just synthetic round watercolor brushes with a good point. You can see these are quite dirty because I've used them a lot. And then my paints, so this is a custom palette. It's just a cheap plastic one I got off Amazon or something like that. It's filled up with watercolors from Winsor & Newton. I buy them in tubes because it's just most cost effective to do it like that when you get through a lot of paint. And then I just squeeze it out, let them dry overnight, maybe a couple of days, and then I just come back in and reactivate it with my brush. And I almost never clean it. I think in the 5 or 6 years I've owned it, I've cleaned it a whole 2 times. So it's not very much. But I just kind of reuse old colours as I go. You can wet it and wipe it with a piece of kitchen roll if you want to. And then another little tip is just to have 2 water cups. So these are both kind of dirty, but I have one for cool colours and one for warm colours. So it just stops the water getting all muddy, and then what happens is that you can use that and then you end up making your colours a bit brown. So yeah, that's my water cup situation.
Awesome. That's nifty. I've never seen someone separate by cool and warm.
Yeah, some people do a system where they wash off in 1 cup and then they pick up clean water for color mixing with another. But I just never went to the right one, so I had to do it cool and warm. It takes a bit of practice, but you can get the hang of it. Right. So I'm probably going to start on this one with the big flower. So I always like to get one big part of the composition done. And what I'm trying to do with this composition is create a zigzag. So the best way to do compositions for florals that works for me is to choose some large areas and then fill, and then use the leaves to create a balance. So what we're going to do is put a big one here, which is this flower, a big one here, which is this rose, and then we're going to fill in a gap with maybe a flower and a bud, and then a little set of flowers. Now, odd numbers work best for composition, so 1s or 3s. If you end up with pairs, you end up with something that looks a bit symmetrical. And then we're going to put in some different leaves, and they're essentially going to come out into the spaces in branches, and then we just fill the rest with individual pairs of leaves. So that's my plan.
Awesome.
So I'm going to get a little water and then just a kind of lemon yellow, mix it in this palette. It's got some other paint in it that'll probably blend in, but doesn't really matter. I'm very much of the gung-ho attitude to colour mixing. I just chuck in a load of different pigments and see what happens. I'll put a bit of pink in there. Okay, so I've smudged already, not to worry. So what you want is, if you're doing light colors like the white, you want a really light watery mix. And then we're just going to drag, and I use my brush sideways and then just drag up for the petal shapes.
So you're just imagining it in your mind before putting it on the paper?
Yes, I'd plan on, so sometimes I do little sketches of just where I want the main elements to be. But I really like just creating as I go, and I know that seems really scary. But I find that if I over plan it and try and force it, then it ends up looking weird and almost, I don't know, 2-dimensional, and it just doesn't seem to work. Whereas if I just, I pick a flower that I really like, put it in the middle, and kind of not into the middle, but slightly off to one side, and then I just create my little zigzag through, then I find the elements almost tell me where they need to go.
Okay.
So it's often a case of, and I'm sure many beginners will know this from if you've ever kind of tried to recreate a work that you've seen from someone else. You try and recreate it, it just doesn't look the same on your page. You really need to look at the picture before you and say, okay, where are the gaps? If I put a flower up here but you don't have space for it, then by all means, do a different thing on your piece of paper. So you'll see that none of these are touching. I quite like that, just to give it a bit of separation. And then we're going to add a little bit of cadmium yellow. So get it nice and thick on the brush, and then we're just going to touch it to that inside edge and do some little lines and just let it spread.
Oh.
There we go. That's nice and
I love
summery.
watching the pigment just bleed in.
Yeah. So you can kind of push back and scoop it up if it goes too far, or you can add a little bit of water to push it out even further. But as much as you can, try and avoid messing with it, because it honestly dries so much better this way. Okay, so next we will do the rose. I quite like a dark red for a rose. It's a traditional Shakespeare kind of rose.
You have to. You live in the town Shakespeare was born.
I know. So much of it is dedicated to him as well. It's you know, he's the only notable person ever to come from here, so they make a big deal out of it. So we're just doing a few circles. I like to make the rose centers really dark for a bit of contrast. And then we wash all of that off and come back for some bigger petals. You can see I try to do this relatively quickly. The reason is just so that it has you know, time to blend before it dries. But this is where the cotton in the paper will give you a bit more time.
Because it won't sink in too fast?
Yeah, yes, it stays on the surface for ages. So you can see by this point, I'm almost just using water. And this kind of contrast from very dark to very light is you know, really fundamental to watercolor painting. Because there isn't a white, so you have to use lots of water to get to very light colors. You can go in and smudge it around if you think that bit's a bit too light. There we go. So we've got our first two in. So next, if I get the reference back, so we've got our first two flowers in, so then we're going to look at some more pink ones, and you can see with these I've put kind of a yellow center in, and then we're going to do some dots when it's dry for a bit more kind of detail and contrast.
Awesome. And for those who have just joined us, I just want to remind you that if you do have questions, please type question in all caps in the chat, followed by your question typed normally. That'll make it super easy for me to spot your question and make sure I don't miss it. If I don't ask your question immediately, it's because I'm saving it for a Q&A at the end, just to not disrupt the flow of Emily's demonstration. And really quick, while she finishes mixing that color, I am going to share our feedback survey with you all so that you can let us know how we're doing with our live demos.
Amazing. Okay, brilliant. So we have our next color. I've just used a mixture of pink and yellow in this. So I'm just going to create a little 5-petal flower. You'll see that I use the brush a lot on the side. It just forces me to stay loose. It's one of probably the most common questions I get, and it might well be in the Q&A, so I might be jumping the gun here, but a lot of people that I've taught over the years have asked me, you know, how do I stay loose? Probably my biggest tip is to get a really big brush and a timer, and just make yourself do it really fast, and that means that you don't have, you know, the ability to go in on the details.
So what colors did you use to mix that pink that you are using for these flowers?
So it's a mixture of opera rose and lemon yellow deep. So it's just a very vibrant pink and then a bit of a yellow. So it creates almost like a corally pink.
It's a beautiful color.
Yeah, I really like the opera rose. It's a bit on its own, it's quite neon. I don't think that's really coming out in the camera, but it is really almost a bit too vibrant. It looks a bit artificial, but as soon as you mix in something like a yellow or a red, it just works really well. I'd always much rather have a vibrant color that I can tone down than one that's a bit muddy that you can't kind of make more interesting. So you can see, again, I'm keeping these petals quite separate. I don't mind if they touch. The other thing I'm doing is trying to vary the value a little bit. So some of them are darker and some of them are lighter. Okay, and then we're going to get some more yellow, mix that into the color, and then we're going to put that in the center. I'm just sort of blobbing it in there and allowing it to bleed. It's more of like a yellowy orange than anything. I really like painting the flowers in kind of warm colors, so oranges, yellows, pinks, and then doing the leaves a bit more cool with more blues.
Is there a specific reason why you do that?
I think it can look a little odd if it's all warm, so I quite like to bring in some cool colors. This is quite a cool red. It's got a bit of blue to it, but yeah, I quite like the sunniness of the flowers, but then to bring in a bit of the shade and the contrast with the cool leaves as we go.
Is that what you think about while you are making your composition?
Yes, yeah, it's definitely a case of thinking, okay, you know, there's quite a lot of warmness down here, so we'll probably use a bit more blue in the leaves, and then where this is a bit cooler, we might put more of like summery yellow greens up here. So yeah, it's just a case of constantly thinking about when you're doing compositions. I'm just going to paint a little bud up here. It's just a little oval with some gaps in it, basically. Nothing too fancy. Essentially with composition, what we're trying to do is always think about, you know, how we can make each section different from its neighbors, so it doesn't all look like it's the same thing. Okay, brilliant. I think it's time to get some greens in here. There's a lot of flowers going on. So I'm going to go over to my other cup. You can't see this on camera. I might budge it over a little. See if I can't get the greens in. I can. There we go.
Before we jump into the greens, do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure, fire away.
Kathy asks, is the opera rose Lightfast? Will it affect the permanence of the composition?
It is, yes, it's a good question. So Lightfast is essentially if a color will fade in the sunlight. So yes, as far as I understand, all of the colors from Winsor & Newton are Lightfast. But bear with me a second. No, I don't think I have. I don't think I have any opera rose in here. Oh, I do. There we go. So. Yeah, it's got a B permanence, so it is Lightfast. It's a bit of an odd one, opera rose, because I think it's dye-based rather than pigment-based. So it doesn't really granulate very well. You can see the yellow granulates a little bit, but the pink doesn't. But yeah, essentially all professional watercolors are Lightfast. The ones you want to watch out for are these sorts, which are the liquid watercolors, which are a lot more prone to fading in sunlight. Although if I'm honest, I have painted with these and had them on the wall for a few years, and I don't think they fade that much.
Okay.
So yeah. But yes, professional grade watercolors are designed to be archival, so they're designed to last the lifetime of the painting. If you're planning to make it into a gift or to sell it, then it's definitely an important consideration.
Thanks for those tips. That's really helpful.
Yeah, you can also find them on the paint manufacturer's website as well. For anyone who wants to check. So I'm just mixing up some different greens in here. So I'm using as a base sap green, which is my favorite green. It's kind of a mid-toned, slightly yellowy green. So I'm going to get a bit of that mixed up and then just put it in where some of these areas are still a little bit wet, so we can get a little bleed like that. And what I'm doing with this is almost creating miniature leaves and shapes that just allow it to connect, a few stems that allow it to connect and bleed where any of the paint is still wet. You can see they're only kind of small shapes, so they're not really full leaves yet, but they just allow us to get some really good wet on wet kind of effects in there. You really want, so you can see there's a bit of a gap here. So what I'm going to do is pull a bit of a stem of leaves out there so that it will fill that gap and follow the angle. So I like to start my stems with the final leaf, so you know where the end one is going to go. And I use quite a few strokes on these to get them in the right place. And then I pull the stem back. And then you can put in the other leaves along the stem. Where you can, it helps to curve stems a little bit because then they look a bit more natural. If you do them too straight, they almost look a little bit static and a little bit false. I'm mixing in some grey here so that I can make the green a bit darker. Okay, there we go. The other thing I'm going to do is just connect up our little bud there, again with a curved stem. Then we'll pull a little leaf off. It really helps as you're going through your composition to keep stopping, have a bit of a look, where are your gaps, and then start to plan out where your leaf stems are going to go. So we'll probably have one there, maybe a little one up here, and then definitely one in this corner here to fill that gap. So I'm adding a little Payne's grey, which is basically just a type of indigo. It's very similar to indigo, which will make it a much deeper bluey green. And then again, we'll do our final leaf. And then curve in our stem.
So as you're thinking about adding these leaves and stems, Embellish Studios asked a really great question. Do you work with the leaves and vines to make them actually make sense? Do they flow as they would in life?
That's a good question. The answer is not always. I'm more than happy to have them be almost abstract. But I try and keep, you know, some semblance of the form has to be true, otherwise the painting won't feel right. So, for example, we try and follow, you know, the general shape, that it has a wider base and then a pointy tip. So that kind of follows the general shape. But if you have, you know, leaves that aren't necessarily connected to a stem, I don't mind that. It's a nice way to fill it in. I'm not concerned with it necessarily looking botanically accurate. I'm sure any gardeners in here would have a heart attack at some of the compositions that I've done. So yeah, it's not scientific.
Yeah. Let us know if you're a gardener and having a slight heart attack with us now. I sure hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, I am so sorry. Konmyo-kun asks, why is the bleeding happening on the dried flowers?
So these aren't actually dry. You can probably just see that one that's gone in there. So this is where the good quality paper is really important for that. So it hasn't quite dried on this bit, which means that it is happening just a little bit. The bleeding is happening so much because I use a lot of water, so the paper is staying wet. You can see this one isn't bleeding, where this bit of the flower was dry, so we've got a little hard edge there. Whereas this one, where it's still wet, is bleeding.
Could you pick up the block to show us how shiny the paper is when it's wet?
Yeah, let me see if I can do it like that. So you can see it looks very wet in some places on those leaves, but then this doesn't look that wet. It's definitely not looking that wet on camera. But this is where the watercolor paper can sometimes surprise you, because you'll think it looks quite dry, and then as soon as you touch it with another wet bit, it will start to bleed in. Yeah, it's sometimes tricky to see, but you can see a slight sheen. It's not coming up that well on camera, which is a shame.
Yeah. To recreate that effect, could we re-wet the paper?
You could definitely go back over it. What you need to do is to make sure that anywhere that you want to re-wet, you do the whole section. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is a hard edge, you know, in the middle of a petal. So if you want to blend into a petal, then re-wet the whole petal.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Let's do a little one here. I also really like to vary the direction of leaves. So you'll see some of them point up and some of them come down. So they give me a little bit more variation for the composition. I also quite like to do a leaf that runs along the edge, so it's almost like it's tucked behind the flower.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Quite like a little bleed. Okay, we've got one probably major gap that we can see here, so let's get that one filled in. Yeah, a bit more colour on there. I quite like to do irregular leaves, so sometimes I get the shape of it and then I just wiggle my brush to give it a bit of a more kind of irregular shape.
And you're still using the same brush you used at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's my size 5. It's a good medium size, and I use it a lot on the side so it can cover quite a lot of area, but you can also, you know, use different size brushes to create different effects. Some people really like to change brushes, but I once I've got one brush in my hand, I find it really difficult to put down. So it just stays with me then for the rest of the painting.
I bet you've learned, though, everything you can do with it by just using one brush.
Yes. Yeah. It's especially the round brushes, because obviously you can use them on their tip and create quite fine lines like I did with the stem, but then you can also use them on their side for much broader strokes. There we go. So yeah, it's definitely sticking to one brush is a good way to see all of the things you can do with it, for sure. And then I might come back in and just add some more different colors to this. Maybe do a really dark one there. While it's still wet, you can have a bit of fun with it.
Drop some color.
Yeah, just let it do its thing. You can also go in and drop, especially if your paper is good, you can go in and just drop a bit of water, and then it will move some of the pigment around as well. Okay, now I'm going to use a bit more of the grey and lots of water, and then just create some little pairs to fill in some of the gaps. Going to do a little one there as well. This is just a case of filling in now. So just having a look at your paper and saying, okay, where is there a lot of white space? You know, where is there somewhere that I could fill in? The other tip that's quite handy if you struggle with this bit and you find yourself, you know, putting it in the wrong place or doing it and then wishing you'd put it somewhere else, is to turn your paper upside down. So then it's much easier to see when you're not looking at the paper from your different perspective. That's also quite common for people who are doing things like portraits. It really helps to turn it upside down, and then you're kind of not biased by your perspective on it. So yeah, that again, that's where I like having the blocks, because they're quite easy to move around. If I've taped my paper to something, I end up having to go around the table myself to try and get a different perspective on it.
That's true. That's true.
So there's a nice big gap up here. You can probably see how much water I'm using in this, that I'm making big old puddles with it. I really don't have an objection to hard edges. I think they're, quite a nice effect, but some people really don't like them. So yeah, you can just pick that up with, a piece of kitchen towel or like a dry brush if you don't like it, if you think it's a bit much. But I quite like to leave them and see what happens.
I think they add a little bit of contrast,
Yeah, I do. I think especially when you're using so much water to lighten your colors, it's a really great way to get good contrast in it. And that makes such a difference when, you're learning to paint. Contrast is one of those things that I know when I started painting florals, they were all exactly the same kind of color and value, and they just look really flat. And learning to use that whole, contrast in there, and then the contrast in the bleeds in all of these spaces. You can see where I've started touching some of these leaves together to create little bleeds. Using that is just a really good way to increase the contrast. And it just makes the pictures look so much better. Contrast is probably the best thing for beginners to, really start to make a difference to their paintings. All right, then I think we filled pretty much every available spot with leaves, which is what we like to see. You can see it's still a bit wet there, and it's just started to bleed up into that one. Okay, again, with the pausing and the stepping back, I think there's actually a bit of a gap here that I'm just going to fill with a really light one. We can say it's properly complete and just get that. You can always go back in and just poke that with a wet brush if it's not bleeding the way you want. There we go.
Wow.
Okay. The very final bit then is just the dots on the center of these flowers. So what I'm going to use is the opera rose mixed in with a bit of burnt umber, which is just a brown.
How do you know when your paper is dry to be able to add those details so that it doesn't bleed as much?
You can really get your head down so you can see it from the side, and then you should be able to see if it's kind of reflecting the light, then it's got a bit of a sheen, and that means it's still wet. The other thing you can do is just test it with a clean finger. So if it's wet, it will feel cold. And if it's dry, it will feel room temperature.
Oh.
So yeah, they are dry. That one might be a little bit damp actually. The other thing you can do is just touch it with a slightly wet brush, because if it is wet, the color will start to spread, and you'll know. You can always then blot it with a paper towel. But yeah, usually you can tell, but sometimes the paper still does catch me out. I will think it's dry and I'll start putting some details on, and then they'll just start bleeding, and I think, okay, have it your way.
There's a happy little accident.
Yep. Yeah, there's no such thing as mistakes in art. It's, it's your painting, you're the artist, you're its master. if you've got quite a big floral composition, these kind of details really help because they just bring down a bit more of a focus. So these are inspired by some wild roses that grow. They're a sort of pinky colour, and then as they get more mature, they open up and they go white, and the pink fades from them.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, there we go.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So I know you'll be having a mini workshop with us
Yes.
coming up in a few weeks. Would you mind telling us what we will be doing then?
Yes, of course. So the mini workshop is going to be split into 2 parts essentially. So we're going to look in the first part at painting 3 flowers, and so we're going to do some that are more like this big round one with more details. We're going to look at roses, and then we're going to look at some small filler flowers, a bit more like these ones. So we're going to look at, you know, the 3 different types of flowers. So a big rose, a big kind of 5-petal flower, and then some little 4-petal fillers. So we'll look at painting those individually, and then in the session we'll also be doing some floral composition. So we'll actually lay them out into a big piece, talk about how to use the leaves, how to try some different compositions and layouts, how to troubleshoot if your composition isn't working, you know, any of those kind of questions. So you will be able to take those elements then and kind of reorder them into basically any floral composition that you like.
Awesome. I'm excited. Thank you so much. And I have a few more questions for you if you don't mind.
Sure.
By the way, Barb Hayes just added a bunch of clapping emojis.
Oh, thank you.
And before I move on, our mini workshops are just $6 US dollars. So it's a great way to learn additional tips and tricks and support Emily as an artist. Okay, so if you have more questions, type them in the chat. And I will start asking you some questions, Emily.
Sure.
Oh, Ramona just asked, or she said, I am impressed, and then asked, will the big pale flower get a center? I guess the one you just painted.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm probably not going to do that on this because obviously I'm trying to keep it to the reference photo, and I quite like the slightly empty space in there. You can put little dots on it. You can also do more like an anemone center, so it's a circle, and then you do a ring of dots and some little lines to connect it. If you want to put in a center that way, you can do a few little strands in a different color. I rather like a little bit of a gap, and then it's almost like a little burst of sunshine from the middle. But yeah, you're free to put whatever you want in the center of your flowers. It is your painting and you are the artist.
Awesome. And is that painting the one you just showed something similar to what we will be learning in your mini workshop?
Yes. Yes, it is. So there's going to be roses, there's going to be little flowers. I'm probably not going to do the anemones, but yeah, it's the whole kind of style is, as you'll see, is really similar. So it'll be something in between these 2 that we'll be looking at. But I really want to look at the different flowers individually, so then you can rearrange it into other compositions as well.
Awesome. Thank you. So by using the 100% cotton paper, is making the bleeds very fast? Is it hard to control?
Yes and no. So again, really good questions. For me, paper and materials is one of those things that it's a proficiency with the water that you get over time. So you'll find that as you paint, you'll start to see, you know, when it's got too much water. So if you've got an area that's very wet and another area that's very wet, what happens is that sometimes they bleed too far, and then you find yourself, you know, trying to pick it up. If the area is one area is really dry and one area is really wet, then sometimes you can get these, which are little cauliflowers. So that's just where the very wet paint has pushed into paint that's much drier. So you get this little kind of white effect here. Again, I really like these. I think they're really pretty, but some people don't. You can also see another one there where some very wet paint here pushed into this dry leaf and then left a little cauliflower. Water control is just something that appears with practice. So the cotton paper definitely keeps it wet for longer. You can play with it. It also gives you time to mop up mistakes and puddles as well before it dries like that. But for me, the best thing to do is really to practice, and then you'll get a feel for when it's too much water or not enough water, and it won't dry in a way that you like, and then you'll learn from that. There's no substitute for practice on this one, unfortunately.
Fair enough. Is professional grade watercolor much different from student grade watercolor? And is it worthy to invest in it since it's quite pricey?
Yeah, really good question. It's tricky to say in terms of investment. So professional grade watercolor paint uses really good pigments, and it also doesn't use things like binders or fillers, which are essentially they pad out cheaper watercolors, but what happens is they have the effect of making them a little bit dull, so they're not very vibrant, they can look a bit chalky. So you get kind of really rich colors like this, and especially this kind of yellow that we've worked with as well. They come from having professional grade paints because they just look so vibrant on the page. They dry and they don't fade so much. They're Lightfast as well. So if you're ever looking at work on social media and on Instagram and you think it looks so much more vibrant than mine, why doesn't mine look like that? It's almost certainly professional grade pigments. So they're more expensive pigments, which is what makes them more expensive paints, and they're not kind of bulked out with fillers to make up. So yeah, that's why they're more expensive. I didn't start painting with professional paints. I think the cost of them is very prohibitive. It puts people off when each tube is kind of several pounds, dollars, whatever. It can put people off. So for me, start painting with whatever is a reasonable price point for you. Buy good quality student paints if you're going to buy student paints. Don't buy the cheap ones that are meant for kids because they never work. They end up looking like a child has painted it, no matter how good you are. I would produce awful paintings with them. So buy good enough quality that you're comfortable with, but don't worry about having the right supplies from the start. I upgraded to professional paints and I did it very slowly. So when I ran out of student ones, I started buying professional ones to upgrade. If you get to the point where you're painting regularly and you're getting frustrated with the results and they're not vibrant, then that's the time to invest in professional paints. What I would hate is for you to, buy more expensive supplies and then feel like you can't use them because it might be a waste or it won't work out, or it hasn't worked and you feel like you're frustrated by it. Buy whatever you can buy and use regularly so that you will practice.
Right, that's a really great tip. And I'm going to go ahead and share Etcher's watercolor set because it is student grade watercolors, but they are we ensure that our pigments work well, they are vibrant, they will stay on your paper, they won't fade away, and they also just happen to be vegan friendly. So if that's something that you care about, it's something to keep in mind. Joanne Brooks asks, do you have a favorite brand of paint?
I do. I really like Winsor & Newton. The reason is that they're a British brand. So as much as I can, I like to support local businesses or businesses who are doing, good things. They are probably the cheapest and most widely available professional paints closest to me. So I think that should factor into your decision as well. There's absolutely no point paying to have paints exported across an ocean if there's a company local to you that make them. Pretty much, you know, the pigments and the colors between the major brands, they're all really similar. So yeah, my favorite brand is Winsor & Newton, but they're what I've used from the start simply because that's what's sold most widely here in the UK.
Right. Okay, thank you. And I know you talked a little bit about your brushes at the beginning, but could you recommend certain shapes, sizes of brushes?
Yes, absolutely. So this is this one that I've used the whole time. This is a size 5. I've also got a size 6. They're probably the most common sizes. These are American brushes, Princeton, so they're again not that widely available in the UK. But yeah, for the round ones, you essentially get 2 brushes because you get, you know, the pointy tip that you can use for very thin lines, and then you can press it for much thicker strokes and wiggle it. And do all sorts of interesting things. So day to day, I paint with a 5, 6, or a slightly bigger 8. If I'm working on a bigger canvas, you can see how pointy that one is.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a size 2 for detail. So this is a little thin one. You can do it for painting little stamen, adding veins onto your leaves, that sort of thing. So size 2 is quite good for details. And then if you want a really big one, I've got, you know, up to a massive size 16, which is quite a major brush. But definitely if you want to kind of splash about and have a lot of water and paint very loosely, then a big brush I do like. I'll be honest, I don't use this one all that much. I tend to stick to my mid-size brushes. And then if you paint a lot of florals, a lot of people also like a cat's tongue brush. So let me just move that out of the way so you can see. This has a kind of rounded end, but it's flat. It's almost 2-dimensional. So it can be used kind of on its side, and it makes some interesting strokes for florals. Have a play around with it, see what works for you. If you want, my biggest recommendation is just to get a couple of good round brushes with a nice pointy tip, because they serve so many different strokes with that kind of simple shape.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm just gonna throw in that Etcher does have watercolor specific brushes as well. Kind of my job, but I also know they're amazing. So throwing that in the chat in case you want to check them out. There's a variety of brushes there. Another question for you. Did you always start with a wide variety of colors, or did you start with a smaller palette? And what kind of colors would you recommend to start with or to invest in?
Yeah, really good question. When I started painting, I bought a little pre-mixed kit, so it had a few colors in. I played around with those. I got very frustrated. It didn't have a pink, which is one of my favorite colors, so it's really difficult to mix a pink, so I found that very frustrating. I started buying tube watercolors fairly early because I found the little pans just a nightmare to keep track of. So yeah, I went out and bought probably 25 colors. I went mad. I absolutely ran up an enormous bill at the art shop. It was like handing over my credit card and thinking, oh my god. It was major. So I bought tons and tons of colors, and I found that the more I've painted and the more proficient I've become in color mixing, the less colors I've needed. So you'll probably see in this any ones that look a bit crusty. I don't use them very much. So yeah, I'll talk you through what's in my palette, because that's probably the easiest way to start. So I have mostly warm colors down here, with a couple of cool colors. I just ran out of space on the cool side, and then I have cool colors on this one. So a black is just worth having because it's good for mixing, a brown, and then I've got a bunch of different yellows. What you really want is to get a few options for your primary colors, so your reds, yellows, and your blues. Most other colors you can mix from those. So I've got a cadmium yellow, which is a warm yellow, so it means it's a yellow that's more orangey, and then a lemon yellow, which is a cool yellow. I've actually got 2 here. So this one is for mixing with greens, and this one is for mixing with pinks, because I love lemon yellow so much. I bought an orange. I don't really use that. I bought various types of red that I don't use, a pink, and then I have a Scarlet Lake here and a Windsor Red Deep. So a kind of orangey warm red, and then a cool kind of bloody, blood colour is probably the wrong word, but more of a kind of cool wine toned red.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just having a warm and a cool version of each of the primary colors. And then I have a purple. You can mix purples with reds and blues, but I just really like a basic purple to start with. And then I've got Prussian blue, which is probably my favorite blue. It's a very deep, cool blue. And then turquoise, cobalt, a cerulean blue that I never use. And then Payne's gray, which is my favorite kind of bluey gray. Sap green, which is my favorite green, a bunch of others that I don't use, Hooker's green, which is more of a forest tropical green, and then I've got some dusty colors down here that I don't use. One of those I think is indigo. Okay. So you can see that I had a lot more colors than this, and I had to put little bits in here and stop using them. So choose what colors appeal to you, because if you like a color, you'll probably paint with it. But my recommendation is to get a warm and a cool of the yellows, the reds and the blues, and then add in some pinks and greens, purples, whatever you want after that. But as long as you've got those kind of 6 main mixing colors, then the rest of it will come from that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sorry, that was a lengthy explanation then.
Hey, it's helpful. It makes sense. So thank you. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much for supporting and participating in our demos. I am going to throw in the chat the link to Emily's mini workshop, so don't forget to reserve your seat because it's limited seating, because you will learn with her a little bit more in-depth tips and tricks on exactly what she did today, but it'll be a little more slow paced so that you can follow along. And I've also thrown in the link for our feedback survey because we really want to bring you content that you will enjoy. So please make sure that you fill it out. That way we can get your precious feedback. And yeah, that's pretty much it for today. You can rewatch this video later on our YouTube channel, and we will see you in the next one.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Emily.
All right. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Right.